So we're continuing with the evolution chapter. This is a big praying mantis talking to a whole bunch of little praying mantises, saying, of course, long before you mature, most of you will be eaten. Actually had that happen in the lab. We had a praying mantis say case hatch in a tank, and we fed them like crazy, but it didn't keep them from catching and eating each other. In nature, of course, they would disperse so quickly that their risks against each other are pretty limited, but unfortunately we had them confined, so even though they should have had plenty to eat, their instinct said, it's moving, let's grab it and eat it. And eventually we started with about 200 of them. I think we wound up with about 4. But this is the way that nature works. Okay, I'm gonna back up here so I'm not using quite as much of this clear stuff as I might. And now we're to Charles Darwin. Charles was upper class British, which matters, just in case that, make sure that it's focused on the screen. Father was a doctor. Mother was, indications are she might have had some mental issues, but it was hard to say in the 1800s. But of course they wanted their son to make something of himself. His father wanted him to be a doctor. As he went to Oxford and tried for a while, found out he couldn't stand the sight of blood. Thought maybe he'd go through the seminary, through religious education, decided he didn't like that. And my impression of his life from what I've read, so some of this stuff I'm kind of speculating, is that like a lot of people in their late teens and going into their 20s, their families bugging them, what are you gonna do with your life? What are you gonna do with your life? What are you gonna do with your life? And you're like, I don't know yet. Now, how he got on this ship, there's a couple of varied stories, but let me tell you about the position that he took. During this era, a lot of British companies that were within the British Navy, they did stuff for the Navy. The Navy supplied them with boats and stuff. They were going all over the world, not just planting their flag and picking up colonies, but also finding potential sources of goods. And so they were sending these little bitty ships all over the world. So much so that they ran into a problem with personnel. Typical British HMS, Her Majesty's ship, had a slate of officers who were all upper strata society. British, very stratified society, still is a bit more than ours. But the officers were all upper strata, and and everybody below them were lower strata. That's the way the world worked, that's the way the ships worked. But they were running out of upper strata people to be those officers. And it had gotten to the point where there were ships they were sending out where the only upper stratum person was the captain. And everybody below him, the officers were experienced sailors who were promoted to those positions, which was great for them, but they were lowborn, and some of the captains were very much indoctrinated that you gave them all orders, but you didn't really hang out with them, you didn't really associate with them very much. And these voyages were taking months and months and months and months. And they were finding that some of the captains were just kind of going insane from the isolation, the social isolation. And they were making horrible decisions, and sometimes they were getting to a pretty island in the South Seas and going, bye, and just jumping, ship, or doing bad things, and the ships were getting lost. So they were trying to find upper class people who had no background in naval stuff, but just to come onto the ship, literally to keep their captains company, to give them someone of their level to talk to. So they had this opening that I think we would call the captain's companion. I don't know what official thing they gave it. And Darwin wound up in that position. Now, some stories say he volunteered, possibly to get away from the family. Some stories say his father arranged it. But when he went onto the ship, he went, well, if I'm gonna be here, I wanna be the ship's naturalist. We call those biologists now. Naturalist was a position, because you'd take samples of things all over the world when you went out. And the ship's surgeon, who was a sailor who had some skills, but really didn't have any kind of science background, went, fine, you can do that, you know it better than I do anyway. And so a lot of the writings you see that he was the ship's naturalist, but that wasn't really what he signed on for. And there's some question as to whether he and the captain got along. You find conflicting reports from his correspondence, although he did keep in touch with the guy through the whole rest of their lives, so I guess they didn't hate each other too much. So Darwin went out to sea. Let's see. I've got one that probably won't show up well on video, so I'm going to put this one up. Here's the world. Started in Great Britain, stopped at the, I don't know, those are either the Azores or the Canary Islands. Islands off the coast of Africa, down, a little bit of islands there, and then hopped across South America. Now Darwin, it turns out, was horribly, horribly seasick. So he took any opportunity he could get to get the heck off of the ship, and maybe it had something to do with the captain, who knows? He actually, at some point along the South American trip, said, I'm gonna hire a horse and I'll meet you guys. Tell me where you're going, I'll go overland and meet you guys. But also, anytime they stopped at islands, anytime they stopped anywhere, he was off. And he was taking notes and taking samples and drawing pictures and doing all sorts of things and noticing stuff about the world that turned out to be incredibly important to what would eventually be his theories. And it was gone for years. When he came back, he just continued to train as a scientist. I think at that point his family was like, okay, whatever you want. We missed you, Charlie. And use my pen. When Darwin was able to take samples from islands and then also take samples from nearby mainlands, or sometimes just different islands, he found that the living things on there were different from this island to the mainland, or this island to this other island. And the level of difference, the amount of difference, you could tie to two other differences. How far apart they were, and how they were different conditionally. We connect Darwin to the Galapagos Islands. They stayed there for a little bit. He hopped around some of the islands. The islands are about 600 miles out from the west coast of equatorial South America, but they're in the middle of a cold current that comes up the west coast of South America from Antarctica. So they are a very different environment than the equatorial rainforests of Ecuador. And they're a long way out. And he's thinking, okay, how did these things get to these islands? Well, they must have come from somewhere. And if they came from the mainland, how far they had to travel is going to have a huge effect on what gets there and what becomes what we would call the ecosystem. But also, as we now know, conditions drive evolution. If they wound up getting there, but the conditions were very different from the conditions that they came from, then this was a new set of parameters that was going to sort through them for strengths and weaknesses. Example. Green iguanas, if you see them in the stores, green iguanas, they're equatorial rainforest plant eaters. On the Galapagos Islands, there's 2 or 3 species of iguanas, but they're not green iguanas like you find on the mainland. They are a species that lives on the rocks in the surf zone and dives into the water and chews algae off of the rocks and comes back up, heats itself up in the sun because the water's kind of cold, dives back down, very good at holding its breath, very good at swimming, somewhat flattened on the backside so that they use their tails pretty good. And then there's an upland group. Now, the Galapagos Islands, because of the way the air goes past it, it doesn't get a lot of rain. They're your classic desert islands. And so they have classic scrubby, cactusy kind of plants, very different from rainforest. And the upland iguanas are these big, bulky, sun-resistant, tough-mouthed iguanas that can chew on the local vegetation and be fine. Where'd they come from? Darwin theorized that big mass of vegetation swept out to sea by a large storm, drifted out to the islands with a bunch of green iguanas on it. It was an interesting idea. It's one of those, how do you test that? Well, somewhere like 30 or 40 years ago, a big mass of vegetation washed up on an island in the Caribbean. And it wasn't just vegetation, it was vegetation and lizards and a bunch of things that had stayed on for, it turns out, months, because there were newspapers in the map of vegetation. This huge thing, bigger than the lab, bigger than like 4 of the labs. And so, but they had dates on it, and they knew a hurricane had gone through the source of that newspaper around those dates. So they knew where the mass had originated and how long it had been at sea, and it had been at sea for like a month and a half or something like that. So the idea that this could happen, the living things could hitchhike out of massive vegetation blown out by a storm, we've actually seen that happen. Darwin hadn't seen it happen, but it does happen. So they get there. You've already kind of, because the conditions on the mat of vegetation are pretty bizarre, you've already sorted through the survivors here to probably sorting for good swimmers, things that can survive a lot of direct sunlight, things that can, eat not very great vegetation and get by, things that can survive on salt water, tricky thing. And then you get to the island, and there's 2 ecosystems that some of the iguanas could take advantage of. The good swimmers could chew algae off the rocks on shore. The ones with the tougher mouths could deal with the upland plants. And before very long, recombining, even though they could probably mate, but mating across the groups is not going to give your offspring advantages. Your offspring are going to be a mix of, this group's advantages and that group's advantages. It's not going to be a great mixture for them. And that's how you get separation of species in the same environment. They call it niche isolation, isolation into different jobs. We'll talk about that later in, I don't know, this semester or next semester. But you get totally new species that way. And that led Darwin to his ideas. And of course he had, all this other stuff that he carried that we talked about earlier. And so he came up with this idea. You ready to write stuff down? Because I'm not scribbling it down. He starts off with, okay, I'm going to tell you stuff and you're going to agree with me. What am I going to tell you? Well, in nature, there are populations of the same sort of thing, same species. Okay. Within that population, they're not all the same. There's variations within the population. Yeah, okay. Some of those variations are inheritable. They can pass on those variations to their offspring, and the variations can remix in the offspring. So far, so good. Nothing, really big, no real thing that people would disagree with. Then the kicker. In nature, conditions pick the possessors of the good combinations of features by them surviving. If you're well suited to the environment, then you're going to survive and you're going to make babies and you're going to pass those trait features on to babies. In situations where the conditions change, then nature is selecting a different group of features than it was selecting before. The winners and losers are not random. They're winners that are well suited to the new conditions and losers that are not well suited to the new conditions. And the next generation is a combination of the survivors. So they're going to reflect features that are better for the new conditions. And if those conditions persist, it's going to continue to strengthen that population for those features. And over time, if the conditions stay the same, we talked about this before, then you wind up with a group in the future that you look and you go, they're so different, they're a different species. They're upland iguanas and marine iguanas. They're no longer in any way, shape, or form green jungle iguanas. He called this the theory of evolution by natural selection, which we've talked about. And a few other terms that go with this. I'm going to move this to the side and show you something. So basically, what he was saying was what they call descent with modification, where over time, remember uniformitarianism, people looked at the world around them and didn't see things happening very quickly. Is that this was the closest to a quick change where a group winds up getting isolated under dramatically new conditions. That's a quick change. But in the world of the past, looking at fossils, everything, they didn't know anything happened like meteors hitting the earth or volcanic eruptions or anything that changed conditions rapidly, because that isn't what they saw in their world. Uniformitarianism kind of drove Darwin's theory to be a gradualist type of theory, how you could accumulate modifications over time and wind up with descendants that were different from the group that you started with. This is kind of a cladogram, but it's not a labeled cladogram. And you get two cheetahs looking at the zebras going, listen, I'm fed up with this weeding out the sick and the old business. I want something in its prime. But the thing is that what we know is they just want something that they can catch and eat. What do the odds tell you? Well, the old and the sick are the ones least likely to be able to get away. Also the ones that maybe don't react as quickly, the ones that don't see as well. There's all sorts of things that are being sorted for by this part of conditions. That the losers are going to wind up being caught by the cheetahs. Sometimes they get lucky and they catch something in its prime. That's a really wonderful thing. Is nature is random that way, where sometimes a really well-suited individual just winds up unlucky and winds up dying anyway. But overall, you weed things out. You weed out the parts that don't fit well. The impalas have turbo on their side, and the lion's saying to the other lion, forget these guys. Sometimes a feature works in conditions in a weird way, is that there are markings on animals that say to other animals, I'm going to stand out in the environment. I want you to notice me as if you're smart and you have some experience, you don't want to mess with me. I'm poisonous, or there's something that's going to be very nasty that's going to happen if you come after me. Skunks are like that. Things with high contrast markings, bees, skunks, a lot of ringed marked snakes, millipedes, lots and lots of things have this thing where basically a potential predator goes, nah, I don't want to mess with those guys. People started to use the term survival of the fittest, except you can't see it. Darwin didn't like the term. He used it like once or twice, but other people used it. But he did use the term fit, that we can kind of see is how well does this feature fit these conditions? How well does this individual with these features fit these conditions? Because evolution's sorting for both. They're sorting for individuals, they're sorting for particular features, picking the survivors. So fitness becomes a big deal, and you can have positive fitness, you fit well into the conditions. You have negative fitness where you don't fit so well in these conditions. We talked about divergent evolution. We were talking about homologies and getting bats from things that are related to shrews. This is a type of divergent evolution that the example of the iguanas fits, where you start with a starting population, and what you get is descendant populations that wind up being different. Is that they radiate out because they're changing in relation to the conditions. Adaptations is a term that is specifically applied in evolution to features. Is that it's a bad term because in English, like evolve, which we don't use quite as much a different way, but adapt is something that individuals do kind of on the fly. Oh, throw this at me, I'll adapt. But adaptations in Darwinian evolution are these features that you have that can be passed on to your offspring. And so adaptive radiation is radiation of these different features that are inheritable, that fit the conditions. One of the big questions that Darwin addressed was, where do new species come from? Speciation. His big book was On the Origin of Species, is that where do species originate? So these are all terms that are associated with Darwin. So Darwin comes back to England, and he becomes a scientist, what we would call a scientist, starts teaching at Oxford, and joins the Royal Society, an organization of scientists, and he's got all these ideas, and he's putting them together, and he's writing them up, but he's not publishing them. Everybody in his circle of science friends knows his ideas. But he'd married, his wife was very, very religious. He knew the implications of getting this thing out into the wide world, that there was going to be a lot of resistance to this idea. There's still a lot of resistance to this idea, especially among people that are religious, and he didn't want to put his wife through that. And years went by. And then this guy, and he did spell his Russell with only one L. Alfred Russel Wallace had a very similar experience in the world to Darwin. He actually gone to South America and had gathered a bunch of samples and stuff, except his boat sank in the harbor, so that didn't work. But he eventually settled in Indonesia. And if you know your geography, Indonesia is a huge archipelago. It is well over 1,000 islands, big islands, little islands, some close to the mainland, some nowhere near the mainland, some close to the big island, some very distant. So it was a perfect place to see the same stuff that Darwin saw and to come up with the same ideas that Darwin came up with. And that's what Wallace did. It actually corresponded a little bit with Darwin. They kind of knew each other at a distance. Wallace, he didn't worry about reactions. He was in Indonesia. So, publishing in London was a great thing, but the reactions weren't going to get back to him. He wrote up a paper about what we would call evolution by natural selection and sent it off to England to be published. Well, the science community is a community. And the word got around, and people went to Darwin and went, "This is your idea, Charles. I mean, I know we trust that he came up with it on his own, because once you told us, it seemed fairly obvious. So the idea is somebody else came up with it, not a big surprise. But we know you're doing it, but he's going to get credit for it if he gets this published, and you never publish on yours. And we know you got all this stuff ready to go." So Darwin sent a letter to Wallace. Darwin was kind of a science star, so I'm sure Wallace was like, "Yeah, okay, whatever you want, Charles." It basically says, "You have some ideas, I have some very similar ideas. Is it okay if we publish our two papers together?" And that's what they did. They published together. Then Darwin had this whole book ready to go. He lived in England, so he was where all the stuff was happening. So he's very much become more associated with this basic idea than Wallace wound up being associated with the basic idea. And Wallace's family is actually kind of pissed off about it. But I don't think, it wasn't anything that Darwin did maliciously to him. It was just the nature of how things worked. Okay, so we got all through Charles Darwin. And now we will pick up some other stuff extending his ideas, because he basically just laid the framework for how this works.